Hello, and a very warm welcome to this special webinar presentation brought to you by the Critical Path Institute. My name's Scotty Kern, and I currently serve as the CPAF's head of the Electronic Clinical Outcome Assessment, or eCOA Consortium for short. One of the contributors to this project we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to be acting as the moderator of the discussion today on the always engaging and almost mystical topic of BYOD use in clinical trials for eCOA. The presentation is going to be sharing a summary of the outcomes of a collaborative project between the eCOA Consortium and also the sponsor representatives within the Patient-Reported Outcome Consortium, or PRO Consortium for short. This project sought to identify, isolate, identify, and perhaps propose recommendations for the best practices for the use of BYOD in clinical trials to capture COA data. So before we get up and running, a quick few housekeeping items. Everyone's muted, so this will be just the presenter speaking today. The presentation will be made available on the respective web pages of both the PRO Consortium and the eCOA Consortium. If you have a question, and we actively encourage as much interaction as we can possibly get, please post your questions or comments via the Q&A function in Zoom. Please do not use the chat function. If you post a question or a comment in the chat, it will be disregarded. If you have a particular technical issue or something you want to make the CPAF team aware of, you can use the chat for that. But if it's a question or comment, again, we encourage you to use the Q&A function. So technical problems, chat; questions, use the question and answer Q&A function. Quick disclaimer that the views are those of the speakers only and cannot be attributed to their organizations or the Critical Path Institute, and the intellectual property is of the individuals concerned. A quick funding acknowledgement. The CPAF is supported by the FDA to the degree as described in the text here, but the contents are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of the FDA, HHS, or any other US government entity. Support for the eCOA Consortium comes from membership fees, and the same for the patient-reported outcome. We have funding from membership fees as well. So I'd like to ask the presenters to join us on screen now, if they could. Thank you, everyone. Our presenters today, experts who have been involved in this project, a long-running project, to be fair, from the outset. Kelly DeMay, Director of eCOA Science and Consulting from Clario. Carl McAvoy, Vice President of eCOA and Patient Technologies of Ypres. Heather Romero, who's the Director of Patient-Centered Outcomes at Takeda. And Chris Barden, Senior Director of Business Development and Commercial Alliances at Kyentis. This, ladies and gentlemen, is your esteemed panel today. Quick agenda for us. We'll be going through just a quick summary of the governing initiative that actually brought this project into existence and very close to closure. I'll talk about adoption, operational recommendations, the key dynamics around data quality, security, and privacy, and the cost versus operational complexity argument. And then we'll wrap things up. We also have some references which we're going to be able to share with you as a follow-up. One key point I need to make is that ultimately going forward, there will be a larger resource made available on the eCOA and Consortium and PRO Consortium web pages. We built a very big deck. What you're seeing today is a condensation of this, or a more fit for purpose for a webinar type presentation. So look out for that. We'll communicate that via the channels. So the eCOA Getting Better Together initiative actually started just over 5 years ago and has already had some great successes in terms of delivering resources, recommendations, education opportunities to the broader clinical research community. The point of the initiative, which started well before I joined CPAF, I've only been with CPAF for just over 3 years, was to create that collaborative, pre-competitive opportunity for sponsors, eCOA providers, CROs, and also FDA as a regulator to try and get to the bottom of those consistent and persistent operational challenges and indeed opportunities. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, where BYOD presents so many chances and opportunities to address so many potential challenges really around the use of or the capture of COA data in clinical trials. And so to open up the discussion today, I will hand over to our colleague Kelly, who will talk about adoption.
Great. Thanks so much, Scotty. Yeah, I'm excited to kick us off here and talk about the important topic of BYOD. It is not a new topic, but it's an important one. And I love talking about BYOD because of what I think it can do for the patient experience. So to start us off, what is BYOD? What are we talking about here? So BYOD, or bring your own device, is the practice of permitting study participants to use personal devices to capture, record, and transmit data in clinical investigations. And I'll note that sensor-based wearables, while an exciting area with lots to discuss around consumer-based, personally owned wearables being used in clinical trials, is not part of the discussion here. So here we will be focusing on participants using their own device to collect electronic clinical outcome assessments, or eCOA. So why use BYOD? If you go back to the previous slide. As a working group, the reason we came up with for using BYOD is to provide a flexible approach that offers choice in how data are captured and reported, which may best suit the participant's lifestyle and the overall study design. So you'll notice that the reason here for why you should use BYOD that we've come up with, it's not about cost, it's not about operations. These are important, and we'll get into that. But the main reason to be doing BYOD is really about offering patient choice, flexibility, convenience, especially with regulatory focus on patient-centric trials. BYOD is one way to accomplish that. It's about making it more convenient for patients so the trial fits more seamlessly into their lives. So it's about offering that patient choice where they didn't have it before. Participants, are familiar with their own phone, familiar with their operating system, and allowing them the opportunity to use what is already familiar to them. While this might seem small, it can really do a lot in offering an overall better patient experience within the study. So it seems simple, right? And many people, I think, outside of our industry might be thinking, well, yes, this seems obvious. Why don't you always allow participants to use their own phone since the beginning? But we all know it's not always that easy. And there are reasons why our industry kind of, I think, took a minute, paused a bit when it came to accepting BYOD as a data collection strategy. So on the next slide, we'll go over some reasons why that is. So when we look at the adoption of BYOD, like all new technologies, it has taken some time for it to be accepted by all. So this is for a number of reasons. As I mentioned, when BYOD first hit the industry, there was at first a lack of regulatory guidance on BYOD. There was also a lack of evidence of BYOD data supporting medical product approval. So that raised questions of whether it would be acceptable to regulators. There were also concerns around equivalency across different device brands and sizes. So for example, BYOD introduces multiple screen sizes, right, which might cause slight variations in the way assessments are presented across device types. And industry best practice tells us whenever you're changing the mode or presentation of an assessment, that you might need to confirm that it doesn't impact the measurement properties, right? That it doesn't change the way patients respond to those assessments. So this was still unknown in the beginning if it did change the way patients might respond. We also need to consider the overall adoption of eCOA, and that will also drive the adoption of BYOD. Other things like copyright holder or author's perceptions and knowledge of BYOD come into play in its adoption, change management within organizations, and just organizations' familiarity with and experience with eCOA generally and BYOD. These all come into play. And in general, we see that BYOD adoption has followed that traditional, adoption innovation bell-shaped curve, with a small percentage being those early adopters. When when we're considering the pool of people or organizations that are already users of eCOA, the uptake of BYOD has probably now reached the top of that curve, leading towards the late majority. It's definitely becoming more popular, but when it comes to the industry as a whole, and considering that eCOA itself is not at, of course, 100% adoption, we're probably more towards that earlier majority. But all this to say, there is really a wide range of adoption right now, but we are continuing to see this increase. And the reason why we're seeing this increase is also for a few reasons. Yep. So as I've described a bit about the early barriers to adoption, but despite this reluctance and these barriers and these open questions, we saw that the COVID-19 pandemic really propelled, in a sense, BYOD adoption. So when the pandemic happened and data collection was at risk due to those not visiting clinics as frequently, this really changed the industry to quickly, implement more flexible strategies for remote data collection. So we saw regulatory guidance comes out that outline these more flexible and acceptable means for alternative modes of data collection. And then we saw a significant number of sponsors pivot to these alternative methods, including BYOD, to ensure that continuous data collection during the pandemic. So we saw, BYOD use increase there. And then finally, we saw an actual example of BYOD being used in regulatory decision-making, as the COVID-19 vaccine studies were among the first clinical trials published that show that they use BYOD to capture data for investigational product approval. So as a result of all of this, BYOD kind of really gained recognition as a viable option to collect PRO data. If you go to the next slide, now, of course, we can't give COVID-19 all of the credit. Regulators and industry thought leaders really responded, I think, to these questions, these open questions around BYOD. And there has really been a flood of guidance and research that have been published in the last few years around BYOD, which I think has really been, the true catalyst in propelling BYOD adoption. So when we look at, for example, the EMA guidance on computerized systems, it specifically calls out that data can be captured by privately owned devices and that it can be either a web or application-based or native-based. The EMA in that guidance really provides a number of best practices and statements around BYOD. So definitely encourage you to look at that. There's also the FDA Digital Health Technology Guidance. This guidance also acknowledges BYOD as an acceptable data collection strategy, even stating a key advantage of BYOD such that it allows participants to use their own device, which again, they might be already familiar with, and this might potentially reduce the burden of using additional DHTs or technologies that they're not already familiar with. So it was great that that even calls out one of the advantages of using BYOD. When it comes to comparability research, I think the most key publication came out in 2017 that looked at measurement equivalence of patient-reported outcome measures, looking at the most common response scale types. So your visual analog scale, your numeric rating scale, your verbal response scale, and looked at BYOD compared to provisioned device. And the study showed comparability between provisioned and BYOD. So this was really, I think, one that eased a lot of concerns around equivalency across devices. And it was really, strong evidence supporting the use of BYOD, as it showed that participants respond similarly, whether BYOD or provisioned. When then last year, there were 2 publications also that came out that looked again at comparability of provisioned device versus BYOD, but then also looked at things like the patient acceptance and compliance and experience using BYOD. It had both qualitative and quantitative data. I won't give too much away here because this paper will actually be covered in more detail by Heather later in the presentation. But again, the point here is also that PRO measures were found to be equivalent between provisioned devices and BYOD. So patients are responding similarly across devices. And it also found similar patient compliance and similar patient experiences across the device types too. And then finally, another pivotal paper was the most recent ISPOR task force recommendation published last year that took into consideration all of the evidence and publications to date around measurement equivalence across device types, which are more than what is just shown in this abbreviated list here. And they conclude that in cases where sufficient evidence of measurement comparability exists, like it does for BYOD, and best practices for faithful migration are followed, that further testing of measurement comparability among data collection modes is unnecessary, including instances of mixed modes such as BYOD. So this consensus paper from the ISPOR task force, I think, also was really critical in moving BYOD adoption forward with its statement about no longer needing to run comparability studies when that evidence of comparability already exists, like it does for BYOD. So yeah, we really thank the industry and these thought leaders and regulatory bodies for providing these useful guidances and research findings around BYOD, and believe this is what is really making the difference, I think, to further the adoption of BYOD. So thank you for your attention. I'll now pass it over to Carl to represent or to present on operational recommendations when you actually implement BYOD. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kelly. So through this section, I'd like to focus a little bit on operational recommendations, and I'll cover 4 key topics. So things like enrollment and how we get participants into the trial, thinking about device allocation and what that might mean in a provisioned or BYOD model, thinking then about translations and licensing and how that happens for a BYOD or a hybrid model, and then moving on to training. And what we tried to do when we set this group up was to, as you know, Kelly has laid out, highlight the amount of information that's out there around the positives of BYOD, why it's acceptable, how it works for patients, how it plays into giving them more choice within the clinical trial. And then from there, building on to, well, it's great to say it's usable, but what does that actually mean? What does that in a practical sense for those setting up and running clinical trials? Next slide, please, Scotty. So starting with patient enrollment, I guess the one thing that's really key to call out here with patient enrollment is that it's really hard to know straight out what suits a patient population. It's impossible to gauge what their preference might be before we address the first patient at a site. This can change based on age, you can base that on demographic, their motivation, the ability of data connection, the availability of devices provisioned or otherwise. But what we can do is make a really good estimated guess based on the experience and expertise we have within these groups. We think about how we start to engage with the participant when they first come to site, thinking about screening visits and what that might mean for them in terms of how they use software, thinking about providing the site with a script or a decision tree that allows them or facilitates them with that decision to the sponsor, to the patients, and not deciding for the patient, but giving the site a kind of a guide on how to talk to the patient about what this device might mean for them versus using their own, bring your own device. We also think about the operational systems, so iOS or Android typically. And, if the patient wants to make that choice over having their own device or a provision device, having the site have a bit of knowledge about that really helps. Also, a key is having a backup solution available. So we know that different patients will choose different things. Again, you will hear about patients from the perspective of their disease, where they're based, socioeconomic factors. There's lots of things that we need to consider along the way, and they do impact many of the choices we make. But it is, to Kelly's earlier point, about giving patients that choice. So there is a certain amount of just in case that goes as part of this decision, but it's really there to make sure that we don't exclude patients specifically from the trial because, for example, they won't use a personal device, or perhaps they prefer their personal device and they don't want to take a provisioned one. So we want to make sure that we can essentially define this and define what's allowed at the site level for the study for the patients to progress through the trial. Next slide, please, Scotty. So when it comes to device allocation and provisioning, again, this is a little bit of an estimate, but it's not just finger in the air. It's done based on experience. It's done based on, setting up different trials across different organizations, different countries, different therapeutic areas. Generally speaking, 30% is about the amount we would provision devices within a BYOD study, so that we give choice to patients at site. And Chris will break down in some interesting examples later on how we figure this out and how we think about that percentage moving through the size of the study. It might be the number of patients, it might be the number of sites, and how we figure that number out. So again, we're not leaving patients stuck or not giving them no choice within that BYOD versus provision decision. We then think about how we distribute the devices across different sites in different countries, the size of a country, regional regulations, availability of the App Store, that can all play into how we get devices where we need them. That will also have an impact on how we get logistically, how we ship devices, if we might need to send more in the future, if we over or under provision, or what happens if sites over recruit. So there's, again, considerations to be made there. We still think about those things with an eCOA model, but with bring your own device, it means if sites are over recruiting, we always have that option of BYOD without having to wait for devices that maybe take a little longer to get to a site. Also, patient demographics can impact this. So we always give age as an example here. That's not in this scenario to call out older patients. We can see younger patients too having a decision there where it comes to using their own device or a provision device. We've seen the anecdote that older patients don't like eCOA. In fact, globally, they're the second most compliant group within eCOA typically. That changes a little bit with BYOD, again, because sometimes the devices they're getting are maybe secondhand or a little bit older. They're getting them from, children or friends or grandkids as they move up to new devices. So that has a little bit of an impact. But patient demographics as a whole has a big impact on how we think about provisioning. Equally, countries and cultural differences across different sites and different geographies might impact how we provision or how we don't. So we could see a model where we have provision devices exclusively in one country, or we might have that 30% split. So again, we can tailor that to the needs of the study and of the patient population. And as I mentioned earlier, socioeconomic factors can always play into this. It plays in more cases in certain regions. But again, it's something that as a sponsor and a vendor, we can talk in the run up to a trial and see how that impacts that particular patient population and then account for that accordingly. So moving on to translations and licensing, always a hot topic within the delivery of a clinical trial, especially with electronic systems. One question we get an awful lot, and this was a point at which we focused on quite a lot through the journey with this BYOD group, was do authors and copyright holders or PRO authors actually allow BYOD, how they feel about it? The answer is yes. Generally speaking, they're all fine with it. There is a little bit of education required sometimes. And by that, I mean thinking about screen sizes, min and max sizes for display of things on screens, language capabilities, how we render things. Sometimes authors like to do a certification process or have screenshot review or maybe have migration best practices that they like followed. And these can differ slightly from the migration best practices that we would know through the eCOA Consortium. And again, they might then also ask just to see screenshots. Our recommendation there is that when we create screenshots, we should try to do them in an electronic format, as in a render of the PROs on a typical representation of a screen that we would see on a typical device. Usually the smallest device you're going to see in the study is a kind of a best practice. There's also some considerations around languages. Some are more challenging than others. It's around how the technology really handles the languages, how they're wrapped, how things will format on a page, where syntax and translations can impact things like screen real estate. Something could be 3 or 4 lines in English, but it might turn into 7 or 8 lines in something like Hungarian. Some languages will require specific fonts so that they can render properly. So things like Minsho for Japanese, Batang in Korea, Samsung in China. There's lots of other examples where specific fonts can be used to render how those languages and those scripts need to look on screen. And again, this is where we think about this from a translations perspective. Good translation and eCOA vendor collaboration is where we start to spot these challenges. And again, with experience, we know what we're looking for, so we can spot these things ahead of time and they stay off the critical path. The last one is around challenges in translations. Honestly, I think this last point sort of lands for eCOA and for paper, and certainly doesn't change very much between eCOA and BYOD, because there's some things that just happen within the translation space that have to happen. They're probably amplified a little by an electronic system, but author-specific translation processes can be one. And by that, I mean, some authors might prefer to have a higher number of individuals involved in the translation and linguistic validation process. So that just by its very nature becomes a little bit longer. But again, that would happen for a new language on a paper version. There's also the impact of rare translations or rare languages. This really comes down to the availability of native speakers or qualified translation providers. So in dialects that are less spoken globally or have less individuals trained as qualified translation providers, that just makes it a little harder to get those individuals onto projects. So that can have sometimes an impact on how we translate. And again, that knocks back to how the translations are displayed within the screen. So a little bit more time in things like screenshot review. And then thinking about the application itself. So depending on how the software is built and how a individual eCOA vendor provides the BYOD to patients, the translations can be handled differently. So sometimes it's the base text within the application that gets handled at a global level. So it's translated for every study. Sometimes it's the text that's within the Android or iOS device that takes over. So things like transition screens, they can either be handled at the eCOA vendor level, or they're handled through the sort of native technology within the application on the patient's device. So again, something to watch out for, but not necessarily a challenge when you're working with an established vendor. And then when it comes to training, I guess the take home here is to not reinvent the wheel. We do a lot of training for sites and for patients when it comes to trials in general. Historically for eCOA, we've always had training sessions, we've had investigator meetings. We make sure patients and the clinics are used to using the devices, they're comfortable and familiar with them. But there's a couple of additional things that we can think about when it comes to BYOD. So from the participant perspective, if we have standard approaches and standard guidance for the BYOD devices and their use, so how a patient downloads the application, how they log in, what they need to do, outlining for them those instructions, letting them know about device compatibility. Often that's done automatically. When you try to download the application, it will give you a message to say it can or it can't happen, and letting them know what we're going to do with the data, how that works, letting them know about data privacy and security. From a site perspective, it's very similar. Make sure we adapt the training guide for them so that we have a clear section on how to set up the provision device, but also account for them in how they handle a BYOD decision and allowing the patient to take that from a provision to a BYOD choice, but also thinking about how we include a script for that clinician on how they can help the patient make that decision. Again, we're not coercing them, we're not pushing them into one or the other, but we want to make sure that the clinician has some talking points and has some answers to commonly asked questions that a patient might ask around why they might want to use BYOD, or if there's any benefits or challenges. Essentially, it's the same, but we want to make sure that sites are comfortable with that decision. And then from a help desk perspective, it gets a little bit more complicated here, but again, it's not something we're unfamiliar with as an organization, as a group. We need to discuss with the vendor how we can help our patients and how we can help our sites when they come to help desk. Tier 1 support for help desk is generally things like forgetting passwords and logins. That's very easy from a provision perspective because the help desk are dealing with just one device type typically. When it comes to help desk for BYOD, it's just different. It's not a heavier lift. It just means that we have to make sure that the sites and the patients are getting the support they need that helps them point towards the iOS and the Android specific changes that might have to happen. So, if you ring a help desk with a provision device, you can get your PIN reset pretty straightforwardly. If you do that with BYOD, there might be an Apple or an iOS or Android issue that the help desk can't reset the patient's PIN, but they can direct them to how they would do that through Android or iOS. So there's some small considerations that need to happen there, but it's again how we support the help desk with that and make sure that the site, the participant, and the help desk is set up for success. So really the adaptation of existing material is the key point here. And with that, I'll head over to Heather.
Great, thank you, Carl. So I'm going to be talking about data quality and security and privacy, specifically to let our audience know, industry-wide, to let you all know, BYOD does not impact data quality, and the industry standard for BYOD implementation maintains privacy and confidentiality of participant data, any potentially identifying data. So now a little bit more about evidence that BYOD does not impact data quality. On the left are some common questions that come up if study teams concerned about using BYOD. These are some questions that might come up. Does it impact compliance, missing data? Is there something about BYOD that changes compliance rates, the patients or participants taking their PRO or COA assessments according to schedule based on device type? Is there any difference in missing data, reason for missingness when it comes to BYOD? So I'll in a little bit, I'll go over in more detail a specific manuscript that was very elegant in talking about addressing these concerns and essentially saying that BYOD does not affect compliance rates or excessive missing data. Some other questions that come up in terms of alarms and notifications. Sometimes there's a concern that the alarms and notifications that help patients remember to take or participants remember to take their assessments according to schedule, that maybe it's not pushed through the same way in BYOD versus provision device. And I can, I work with a lot of our member firms within eCOA Consortium. So I can say, the typical implementation strategy of BYOD ensures that those alarms and notifications, they're getting pushed through to participants equally, regardless of device type. Other questions are about technical device issues. For example, if there's a participant who changes devices or loses their devices or their own device breaks, how can they switch over to a different device? Is that possible? And so the answer is yes. The typical implementation is such that if those situations happen, it's an easy switch. It's implemented differently across industry, but it is an easy switch for that to happen, especially with the support of some of the implementation aspects Carl was talking about with help desk, site support, and so forth. There's also some concern about compatibility with patient devices. So some of what Carl was talking about again, there's tried and true processes during screening visit, for example, or the first participant visit, to ensure that the app is indeed compatible with a participant's device. And if not, this is where a hybrid approach is helpful. You can just switch over from BYOD to PD to provision device if that happens. So we see that a lot, and it works really well. There's some questions about interruptions from other apps. If participants using their own device, do those apps interrupt their ability to complete the assessments? Again, the typical BYOD implementation means that that's not a concern. And then we have research also to support that. And then there's the question about data equivalence, something that Kelly had brought up in terms of, is there measurement equivalence between device types? So I can say that I'll talk a little bit more about that for just a second. So there's a growing body of evidence that supports that there's measurement comparability between paper and device type. A lot of the literature that Kelly was summarizing, a lot of those manuscripts written with CPATH co-authors and so forth have established that there's measurement equivalence, especially the key point in those manuscripts is in presentations that when we talk about measurement equivalence, is as long as there's minor modifications, as long as there's the minimal modifications to adapt to the different device type, then we can be assured that there is a comparability between device types. Because of that growing body of evidence, that means we also, so when I get questions about data equivalence, it means that we don't need to do a standalone data equivalence study as long as there's only minor modifications between device types. Other studies have explored specifically BYOD and have demonstrated that BYOD compared to provision devices, there's equivalent daily completion rates, high participant acceptance, and score equivalence. And so now a little bit more about this study I've been looking forward to talk to you all about. It was written by Stacey Hudgens and team and co-authors, and they looked specifically at comparability of PD versus BYOD in a patient population who have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. Key to this, among the key aspects of this study, of this NICE study, is that the average age, so first of all, the average age is 65. It's an older patient population. They're very chronically ill. And so a lot of the results of this study, you can you can infer if there's equivalence BYOD versus PD in this severely ill older adult population, then it's going to apply for other participant populations that may be less severe or a variety of ages. So more specifically, what they found is they compared PD versus BYOD in terms of compliance rates, score agreement, and overall equivalence. They found that scores, multiple PROs that are common in COPD populations, those scores were equivalent between device types. Participants responded consistently across all device screen sizes as well. So some of my colleagues today had talked about screen sizes. They systematically analyzed that and found no difference. So we can be rest assured that as a screen size that meets a minimum requirement will be consistent for BYOD implementation. They also looked specifically at missing data and found that it was not associated with device type, is comparable for both device types. And then also the reason for missingness didn't vary between device types either. Participants also reported that interruptions like phone calls coming in or text messages, that it did not impact their ability to complete the diary. So that's really strong evidence that we can use to be assured. All right, and now a little bit more about data security and privacy. Personally identifiable information, PII, that's not new in eCOA. So as it applies to BYOD, if there is information that we need to glean in order to get the participants set up on their own devices, for example, a phone number to set up the alerts and so forth, that access must be appropriate and fully justified. Again, industry-wide, eCOA vendors who are experienced in this area have a tried and true approach to implement that while maintaining privacy and security of PII information. Of course, as some of my colleagues here alluded to, we also need to clear explanation to trial participants about where their data is held and who can access that and why. So between informed consent and other patient training materials, such as quick reference guides and so forth, there's clear ways we can communicate to participants that their data is secure and private. And in those documents, in those materials, they're in patient-friendly language as well, so that participants can understand the technicalities of it, but in patient-friendly language. There is an EMA document that we reference in the reference section with a link. It covers a lot of the regulatory requirements, but basically, all the requirements like app level security, that's irrespective of device level access, making sure that there's encryption, making sure that there's a supported operating system and version that the app's being loaded onto. All of those regulatory requirements, they're clearly outlined in that EMA document, but then also industry-wide. Again, I'm here to assure you all that for those with experience in this space, they have ways to maintain all of that security. So all to say that the security for BYOD is equivalent to provisioned devices. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Heather. Appreciate that. So I have the ability here to talk to you a little bit more about some of the practical aspects around running BYOD studies. Some of the questions I typically get asked are, will I save money? Or how hard is it to run? So I'm going to try to run through some of those, and I'm going to have a model to kind of explore that. So next slide, please, Scotty. Okay. I think while cost is generally central at most people when we're talking about eCOA generally, I think what it's really important to highlight the entire consortium really is focused around patient choice, right, being the primary driver. So the primary driver should really be the patient preference and combined with the capability of their own device. So they may want to use their own device, but they may not be able to use their device. So we need to have a backup so they can join the study. Now, when we're looking at savings, and I think what it's interesting to recognize here is that we have a number of eCOA vendors that are part of the group. And while we collaborate on a lot of items, pricing is something that is still a little taboo, that we didn't necessarily talk about it. So this will be some generalizing conversations around pricing and potential cost savings. Of course, there's large ticket items such as devices and telecoms and logistics that remove away when you're using a BYOD study. But there are also a lot of line items that still kind of stay within the actual pricing. You still have a help desk, we still have hosting. So there's a lot of items that still remain the same under eCOA general ideas. But I think as a general rule of thumb, the larger the study, that you'll see a more significant savings in the area to it. Now, of course, that does come with complexities as well. And I think what the key thing really is to look around complexities is how we're going to practically manage the study. So how many patients are we going to use? How many countries are going to use? Well, the idea is, where are we going to put these backup devices that we're going to use? In the region, Carl talked about 30% provision devices. How can we manage those in a slightly unfamiliar kind of manner when we're doing those? There's also the patient population that's been discussed as well before, where maybe we can have a more aggressive BYOD approach for younger people, where they've got we know that there's going to be a stronger uptake, or maybe we'll have a less of a range for elderly patients because maybe they don't upgrade their devices towards the end of it. So we've got all these complexities that kind of match into the study that we've kind of got to work out. But I think what's really important to know, that even if there's minimal savings or smaller savings on some smaller studies, patients may still prefer to use their own device. And I think it's important that patients have a choice and that we give them the choice these days. I think it's almost expected that we give patients a choice. Go on to move on to the next slide, please, Scotty, and I'll try to explain a little bit more, because sometimes it's easier to see in a picture than it is of some words. What we've got here is a kind of some modeling, and it's a simple model of taking out examples. We're not including geographical considerations in this, or we're not looking at patient profiles, but we've got kind of 5 studies that we're kind of looking at a comparison of how many studies are in the versus provision device versus a BYOD strategy on this particular study. So we're looking at how many patients are individually in each site. So if we look at the bottom of the graph, we can see that for a study of 50 patients, we standardized around 25 sites for the entire study. It's very easy to manage on two devices per site. 2 patients will be re-enrolled at each site. So on a traditional provision device strategy, we know exactly that we can send 2 devices to each site. Maybe we'll have a backup device. So we know exactly what we're going to send and where we're going to send it and when we're going to send it. So we're in full control. When we look at a provision device study, and the guidance is around 30% backup. If we look at 30% backup, that really only gives me 15 devices. Now, I'm running a study with 25 sites. I have to have the ability for a backup at every site. So already we are challenging the 30% kind of recommendation rate on this size of a study. We also have the additional risk that if the first patient comes into the study and for a reason decides to take a provision device, there is no secondary device at that site. So maybe we have to think about our provisioning rates a little bit carefully, a little bit more sensitively, a smaller kind of level study. As we kind of move up into the kind of the next level, so maybe 100 patients in this study, maybe there are 4 patients per site. Now, in that regards, again, we could look at a 30% provision rate. That'd be 30 devices. Well, that means I've got 5 additional devices. Where do I put them? So maybe I only need to provision 25 devices for this particular study. Again, we have the same considerations around spare backups, etc. As we start to move up into the kind of the higher echelons of the study, so 250 patients in a study. Now we've got 10 patients per site, assuming that we've got a linear recruitment rate, of course. Again, we're sending 12 devices as a provision device, but we now only have 3 devices that we have to send for a BYOD study. So we're starting to see some significant device reductions within the study. Also, we can put in some smart checks within this. So maybe the first person will monitor what the first site recruits, and if they're recruiting a provision device, maybe we'll just give them a quick call to make sure, was there a reason why it was a provided device? Was there a problem with it, or were you just more comfortable giving a provisioned over a BYD? If we track it and we see that they've assigned a BYD first, wonderful, we know they're fully bought into the actual BYD study. And again, as you go up into the larger size studies, so the 1,000 size studies, now you're seeing really significant savings. Instead of sending 40 plus devices to a site, we can send a minimum of 12 devices to a site. And we're really reducing the actual burden now. Maybe this is a vaccine study from before and they're only on the diary for a week. So this is a real good scenario where you can see there's some strong kind of cost savings in that aspect. What I would say is that even though there's the smaller studies may seem harder and more difficult to model, maybe they're rare disease studies and the patients are more familiar with their own devices and they want to use their own device. So just because the dynamics are different and more complex doesn't mean that we should discard the elements of it. And just because a study is maybe a little bit larger, we may need to, we still have to have some backup devices. I don't think that's critical. What I think the take home for me is that we know that eCOA is complex. We know there's so many moving parts and no studies are saying we could take this model and model it for 50 sites or 100 sites or however many sites were in your study. But as long as you make sure you understand the ratio between your patient sites and the backup, I think your eCOA vendor of choice will be able to help you manage successfully to deliver an eCOA study. So with that, I think I pass back to Carl.
Thanks a lot, Chris. So in the interest of time, I won't spend an awful lot of energy on this slide because I think we've covered some of these points in great detail. I'll just sort of summarize what we've jumped through. So I think from Kelly's perspective, starting off, we really talked about choice and flexibility here and how that benefits trial participants. But I think as we go through the deck, you'll realize that actually that choice and participation, choice for the participant, actually brings some benefits to the trial more generally. And I think that's worth repeating through this deck. And we see it even in the Q&A. I think there's plenty of evidence from a regulatory perspective that what we're doing with BYOD is absolutely acceptable. There's lots of recommendations out there. You don't just need to take our word for it on a webinar, but actually go. I'd encourage you to look at the CPATH website, look through the resources and the references we've put in through the deck. There's some big names there from large organizations who've been at this for a while and giving that kind of scientific rationale with real data behind it, proving, where we're seeing these studies and these types of studies having an impact. I think it's interesting that we show from a data quality and privacy perspective that there's consistency and comparability in the data. We talked about this from a paper and an eCOA standpoint at the very beginning of this journey 15 or so years ago. But now we talk about it, that same equivalency from eCOA, a provisioned versus a BYOD device. And then from Chris's perspective, looking at the rate of provisioning and how we impact that at a study level, it's more than just cost. It's not just the dollar amount. It's about thinking about how we actually bring benefit to the patients and the trials. It's ease of getting the patients into the trial, ease of getting an application that collects the data, the meaningful data for patients that we can use to, to show the effect a treatment has on patients. Again, as Chris said, maybe the size of the study impacts that, but equally the therapeutic area. If it's a rare disease, allowing us to cast our nets a little wider and get to patients through a BYOD approach that maybe we wouldn't, it makes absolute sense, more than just financially. And it is a real sliding scale. It's not so straightforward to just look at one factor or another that controls BYOD versus provision. There's really lots of different things we need to keep into consideration. And that all centers around those operational recommendations. So we talked about this hybrid approach and the idea that provisioning percent will change. I think Chris's example there, the case study really highlights that and how it changes from patient group to patient group, study to study, or even country to country. Thinking about training and adaptation for clinics, letting them realize that there's not a huge difference in terms of setup and managing patients when they use BYOD to how they would typically handle a provision device. And then I guess finally, just to call it out, when we're talking about choice for patients, a big part of that is data privacy, and patients will often question that. So I think it's really important that we as sponsors and as vendors call out to participants, how we're going to use that data, what it's being used for, why we're collecting it. And we've done this in the past just with COAs, but I think when it comes to using a provisioned versus a BYOD device, the BYOD device certainly adds that question, or it comes up more frequently, so always worth considering that and addressing it with patients, either through the ICF or through that discussion we have with the clinicians at site. And last slide, please, Scotty. So just a snapshot of the road ahead. I think we've covered this, but we know now BYOD is acceptable to patients. It gives them greater choice within the trial. I think from a regulatory perspective, we've already said this. The equivalence question, I would hope, has been put to bed. We've answered that. In my 12 plus years, I've never seen a single equivalency study fail. I've never seen us show evidence that an electronic system is not the same or better than paper, and likewise with BYOD. From a sponsor's perspective, increased access, ease of access to patients is a huge benefit. There is that cost piece too, but it's probably more about return on investment than it is on cost. I think, again, that's highlighted in the example we worked through. So I guess to close, I would say that, BYOD, Kelly sort of touched on this with the scale of people adopting or not. It is a bit of a revolution. It feels like it's been a long time coming, but I think I would encourage people to continue and join us on this road. Genuinely feel from patient feedback and from groups we work with that the participants will thank us for this. And as I mentioned earlier, don't just take our word for this. We have all of these resources, guidances, and references on the CPATH website. So have a look through, read it for yourselves and plan carefully. And I think once you make that decision, you'll realize the benefits of using a BYOD approach. Over to you, Scotty.
Thank you so much, Carl. Really appreciate it, everyone. So I just want to acknowledge there was a lot of people involved in this project, only a selection of which involved in the presentation today. I don't have time to go through every name, but thank you so much to everyone who got us to where we are right now. I feel like we've got a little bit more to go because we've received a lot of questions, as you could probably predict. We only have a few minutes left. We don't have time to get through them all. What I'd like to do is to collect some of these questions, and some of you would have been aware of something called an eCOA clinic, which we ran last year, which was incredibly interactive and got a lot of really good questions. We're going to take these questions and use those as seed questions for our next eCOA clinic. My commitment to you is to try and get that done in the next couple of months with the panel that we have here. But thanks for sending the questions. We got time to certainly address a few. But again, this is rather than just writing responses to these questions, I think it's important that people hear the discussion. So we're going to pick up on a couple if we could. Let's look at the question that we received around the caregiver role. If a study uses a caregiver in addition to a participant, is there a consideration of having the ability for both the participant and caregiver to download the app? Carl, would you mind taking that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess different vendors will offer different solutions. Some people will have the ability to have separate apps for separate users. Generally speaking, people will use the same app but have a different login. This might sound like I'm avoiding the question, but I think what's more important than having multiple versions of an application is actually knowing how we handle the data. I'm not sure they're on, but there's a couple of individuals from Adelphi Values who presented a really nice session at the PRO Consortium meeting in Washington back in April. And if whoever asked the question, if they want to see the slide deck, I'd encourage them to have a look at the CPATH website, where we basically looked at how different respondents can give different scores for patients. So mums or dads might score pain, for example, in children differently to each other. In families where parents are separated, children's responses will change from day to day, from if they're with mum and dad, if they're with a mum, or if they're with the dad, or if they're in a different location at the weekend versus at home. So there's sometimes a clear difference in how individuals respond on behalf of the patient. I think that's the bit that's a little bit more critical. And I think this is where good statistical analysis, adding data points to so knowing who's logging in, having a time point for that so we can see days and weeks and patterns, we can know which caregiver is administering the scale. I think that ultimately leads to a better insight in the data. And it helps us then to figure out how we look at that disparity and how maybe certain caregivers responding differently could impact potentially the drug and the results that we see.
Great answer. An important question. Thank you so much, Kelly. I'd like to come to you with this one. What are the requirements with presenting BYOD screens for ethics committee or IRB if they're patient facing?
Yes, yeah. I think in our experience, and I think in most people's experience, typically you can show just a representative screen or representative device screenshots for IRB and ethical committee submissions. And I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to also say, it's even questioned whether we need screenshots at all for IRB submissions. And some IRBs have come out to say that they don't need screenshots. And really what you're wanting to present to IRB and EC are the patient-facing forms and the content of those forms for their review of ethical considerations. So even paper forms are acceptable to a lot of ECs. But when you are, and you do want to submit the screenshots of the forms, typically we see that like one representative device would be sufficient in our experience.
Absolutely. I've heard that many times. Thank you, Kelly, so much. A question, and I think we might have time for two more, but let's quickly jump in. BYOD approach for complex oncology studies. Heather, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. So for complex oncology studies, when it comes to BYOD, honestly, there's not anything different you would do for BYOD versus PD. And in fact, for most oncology studies, a recommended approach is to use hybrid, and the patient can determine for themselves which device type to use in a way that makes sense for them. The only complex design issue I can think of in oncology studies, for example, would be when it's not daily assessments. For example, if they need to complete the PRO 7 days in the run up to their study visit, that's a complexity. But again, it doesn't matter whether it's PD or BYOD. In fact, BYOD is a great approach because they don't have to, pull the phone, out of the wherever they hid their phone for the last 3 weeks. So again, nothing special for oncology studies when it comes to BYOD.
Great answer. Thank you, Heather. And a last question very quickly, an interesting one. Chris, is the BYOD dynamic just created by the vendors to save money?
I don't think so. I think it's interesting. I think when we look at when eCOA started and the conversion from paper to our first electronic, I think we're in a very similar position to BYOD. I think when it first started to come out 10 years ago, yes, I think the vendors were pushing the BYOD model. And then it was the procurement teams that were saying, can we save some money? But I think now it's really, we're getting more and more requests from operational teams saying we want to help our patients. Can they use their own devices? And how do we do it? So it's more practical now. So it's being driven really by clinical teams and operational teams rather than other vendors. And the vendors, yes, we will offer both because we do need to have a backup for patients, and we do need to have the ability to use the patient's own devices. So we're following the trend, but I think now the demand really is coming from the operational teams and from patients demanding to use their own device because they don't want to carry a number of devices around. So I think the vendors are actually now following the market rather than leading the market.
Appreciate that answer. Thank you so much to all my panelists. I just want to draw the attention to the references. Again, there'll be follow-up on this. Please look out for communication of our second eCOA clinic on BYOD, which will come up very soon. But thanks to all attending. Really appreciate your input. And we look forward to the next discussion on the always interesting BYOD. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Scotty. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.